I remember the sound before I remember the pain. It is curious, the order in which the senses depart from a body. One might imagine pain would arrive first, loud and tyrannical, insisting upon its dominion over bone and blood. Yet it was sound that claimed me, a thin rushing in my ears, like the tide dragging pebbles backward into a dark and patient sea, and beneath it the distant, splintering echo of my own breath, growing shallower, less certain of its obligation. The boards beneath my back were uneven, cold through the fabric of my robes, and somewhere close to close the ragged inhalation of the Dark Lord's great serpent lingered in the stale air. I did not move. Movement had already become an extravagance, and I have never been a man given to indulgence. This shrieking shack has always been an ill-made structure, assembled in secrecy and in haste, never intended to shelter comfort. Its walls exhale rot. Its nails protest the burden of holding things together. It is a fitting chamber in which to conclude a life constructed from necessary falsehoods and deliberate silences. Dust drifts in the dimness like pale, aimless spirits. Moonlight finds its way through cracked panes and settles in broken shapes upon the floorboards. And I find that I am absurdly aware of how the light does not quite reach me. I am suspended in the space between illumination and shadow, which seems, in retrospect, a faithful summary of my existence. The venom spreads without theatrics. There is no screaming. The snake struck with precision. It was not personal. I have always respected efficiency. A warmth blooms at my throat and then drains, replaced by a coolness that seeps downward into the hollows of my collarbone and ribs. I taste iron, but it is faint, as though diluted by memory. My hand lifts almost of its own accord, not in appeal but in assessment, fingers brushing the wound as though I might catalogue the sensation for future study. It is an old reflex, the scholar observing his own undoing. The blood is thick. It slides between my knuckles and darkens the grain of the wood. I think, distantly, that I should be irritated by the mess. There is a curious clarity that comes when the body recognizes its approaching irrelevance. The mind, freed from the necessity of directing limbs and breath, begins to wander. Mine has always wandered into books, into shadows, into calculations of risk and cost, but now it wanders without constraint. I find myself listening not to the serpent, not to the collapsing hush of my pulse, but to something subtler. It is a sound I have heard before, though rarely acknowledged it. The sound of my own name, spoken by different mouths across the years, each shaping it with a different intention. Severus! My mother's voice was the first to give it contour. She spoke it softly, as though afraid that speaking too loudly might summon attention from rooms best left undisturbed. In her mouth, my name was an apology and a promise entwined. She would kneel before me, smoothing the dark fringe from my brow, and murmur it as if the syllables themselves might serve as protection. Severus, a name that carried the severity of ancient Rome, the sternness of forgotten emperors, bestowed upon a boy in a soot-choked town beside a sluggish river. I did not understand then the quiet defiance contained in that choice. She had named me for strength she hoped I would possess, or perhaps for severity she feared I would require. My father rarely spoke my name at all. When he did, it was stripped of nuance, a command or a condemnation. There is a difference between being called and being summoned. I learned it early. From him, my name was a sharp instrument, a thing flung across rooms to wound or to remind. It never lingered in the air. It struck and was done. Lily, however, Lily shaped my name, as though it was something delicate, something worth holding a moment longer before releasing. In her laughter, it soft. In her confusion, it sharpened. I remember the first time she said it, standing in the unremarkable stretch of grass that divided our houses in Coworth, the wind tugging at her hair as though it sought to lift her from the earth. She had asked what it meant, and I had given her some half-formed explanation about old languages and old meanings, unwilling to confess that I liked the sound of it in her mouth more than any etymology could account for. When she said Severus, it was neither apology nor command. It was recognition. There are few things more intoxicating than being recognized. The venom continues its patient labor. My fingers grow numb. The boards beneath me no longer protest my weight. It is as though I am receding, not upward, not downward, but inward, folding into the quietest chamber of myself. I wonder, fleetingly, if this is how potions feel as they cool, having boiled with intention, only to settle into stillness once their work is complete. Footsteps echo below. I am aware of them as one might be aware of distant thunder. There is urgency in them, youth, panic. The boy will come. He will kneel where I now lie. He will look at me with those eyes her eyes on. He will demand answers he does not yet understand how to ask. I have spent years preparing for that gaze. I find I am tired of preparing. It is a peculiar fate to have one's life hinge upon a single overheard fragment of prophecy. The words come back to me now not as they were spoken, but as they have lived within me an echo that refused to dissipate. I had stood in shadow then, too, as is my habit, listening through a half-closed door, more curious than cautious. I did not know that curiosity could serve as a blade. When I carried those words to the Dark Lord, I believed I was offering him currency, nothing more. I did not yet understand that I was purchasing my own damnation at a price I would not be able to repay. There are those who would call what followed redemption. I have never cared for the terms. Redemption implies a balancing of scales, a tidy accounting in which virtue offsets vice. Life is not so obliging. The scales remain uneven. One simply chooses which weight one is willing to bear. I chose mine the night I went to Albus Dumbledore and spoke her name as though it were a spell to ward off annihilation. Protect her, I had said, though what I meant was protect the one light I have ever known. The child, the husband, collateral considerations at best. I was not noble. I was desperate. The shack shifts with a sigh. Somewhere a beam settles. I recall another night, another dying body in a different tower, and how the air had tasted, thin coal, thin, threaded with starlight. I had raised my wand and spoken the curse with precision, because precision was the only mercy left to offer. There are those who believe killing must be accompanied by rage. They are mistaken. The most devastating acts are often performed in silence, with hands that do not tremble. I did not tremble. I had already rehearsed that moment in my mind 100 times, stripping it of sentiment until only necessity remained. When the green light struck him, it was not triumph I felt, nor even sorrow. It was completion of a task long agreed upon. The serpent's breathing fades, or perhaps my hearing does. The line between internal and external blurs. I have lived so long in duplicity that it is almost fitting to depart uncertain of which sounds belong to the world, and which belong to memory. My body is an abandoned classroom now, chairs overturned, chalk dust settling, lessons concluded. It would be convenient, perhaps, to drift immediately into recollection of grand events, battles, betrayals, revelations. But the mind does not arrange itself according to narrative elegance. Instead, I find myself remembering the river at Spinner's End, not the grand rivers one reads of in histories, but the sluggish, narrow ribbon of water that carried factory runoff and the detritus of neglect. I would sit upon its bank as a child, knees drawn to my chest, and watch how it moved without apparent urgency, accepting whatever was cast into it without protest. I admired that quality, to endure without complaint, to carry, refuse, and still continue forward. I did not yet know how thoroughly I would emulate it. My mother would sometimes join me there, her thin hand resting upon my shoulder. She spoke little of her own past, but in fragments she revealed a world of high ceilings and ancestral pride, of spells whispered in corridors lit by floating candles. The Prince family, she would say, once held its head high. Once. The word hung heavy between us. Decline is a subtle poison. It seeps through generations, altering posture and expectation alike. She married beneath her station, they said, for love, perhaps, or for escape. I never asked. It seemed impolite to dissect the ruins of someone else's hope. Magic manifested in me early, though not in the flamboyant bursts that excite applause. It was quieter, controlled. A glass trembling on a table before shattering, a door locking itself when anger rose too swiftly. I learned to conceal it, not from shame, but from prudence. The world beyond our door did not understand what it could not measure, and I had no desire to provide it with spectacle. When Lily's magic erupted, flowers opening at her step, petals drifting upward as though in saluti, recognized in her not power alone, but joy. She did not conceal, she celebrated. It was, perhaps, the first difference between us. The venom reaches my fingertips. They no longer answer to intention. I am aware that I should speak when the boy arrives. There are memories to transfer, truths to relinquish. I have carried them long enough. The act will be simple. A wand, a thought drawn like silver thread, the relinquishing of burdens into another's keeping. It is a curious thing to entrust one's narrative to the son of one's rival. Life possesses a taste for irony. I do not fear death. This surprises me less than it might surprise others. Fear is most potent when one believes there remains something to lose. I have forfeited reputation, affection, and comfort in measured increments over the years. What remains is, at best, fatigue. There is a serenity in exhaustion. One ceases to struggle against inevitability and instead observes it with detached interest. How precisely will it unfold? How does the body extinguish itself? These are questions of process, not of panic. If there is regret, it is not for suffering endured, but for words left unspoken in moments where silence seemed safer. I have been a master of silence. It has served me well. It has also isolated me more effectively than any prison. There were times, rare flitting, when I might have allowed a crack in the facade, a kindness not disguised as sarcasm, a truth not couched in contempt. I chose otherwise. Contempt is armor. Armor is heavy, but it prevents penetration. I wore mine diligently. The shack's door creaks. Yes, the footsteps are closer now. I sense the boy's presence as one senses a draught subtly insistent. There is a tremor in the air that was not there before. He will kneel. He will see not the professor who deducted points with surgical cruelty, nor the headmaster who spoke in measured tones from behind a desk, but a man undone by venom and time. I wonder which version will trouble him more. Severus, the name again, but now it is not my mother, nor my father, nor Lily. It is Albus. He spoke my name with infuriating calm, even when I raged. He understood, perhaps better than I wished, the currents that drove me. He trusted me with tasks that required not goodness, but resolve. Severus, he would say, fingers steepled, eyes bright with secrets. In his mouth, my name was neither soft nor sharp. It was deliberate. He believed in my capacity to choose rightly, even when I doubted it myself. I resented him for that faith. It is uncomfortable to be seen as capable of virtue when one is acutely aware of one's own failings. I have often considered whether my life might have unfolded differently had I been sorted into another house. Had I resisted certain friendships? Had I chosen humiliation over retaliation in that fateful moment by the lake? These speculations are as futile as attempting to unbrew a potion once ingredients have fused. One may analyze the misstep, note where the flame burned too high or the stirring faltered, but the brew remains altered. Regret is an academic exercise. Action is irreversible. The boy is here. P kneels. I sense the shift in air as he lowers himself beside me. There is a sharp intake of breath, his, not mine. I force my eyes to focus. The world swims, edges dissolving into grey, and there they are, green, unmistakable, the same intensity, though framed by a face that carries traces of another. For a moment, time fractures. I see a child in a sunlit field and a young man in a ruined house, and the boy before me, all superimposed. It is almost enough to disrupt my composure. Look at me. The words emerge as fragments torn from a throat that no longer cooperates. I need him to see, not me, precisely, but what I have guarded. Memory is a fragile vessel. If left untended, it warps. I cannot allow that. With the last of my strength, I draw forth the silver strands that have defined me. They spill from my temple like liquid moonlight, pooling between us. Each filament contains a year, a choice, a sacrifice. I have hoarded them long enough. As they leave me, I feel lighter. Not absolved such. A term implies judgment rendered but unburdened. The venom has done its work. My pulse falters, then steadies in a slower rhythm, as though reconsidering its commitment. The boy gathers the memories. He does not yet comprehend their weight. He will. The ceiling above blurs into darkness. The moonlight recedes. The rushing sound returns, softer now, like wind through distant reeds. I find that I am no longer cold, nor am I warm. Sensation itself becomes abstract. I am aware of the floor only as an idea. The shrieking shack dissolves at its edges, boards and beams surrendering their solidity. Severus. One final time. But now the name is mine alone, not spoken, simply present. It no longer carries apology or command or recognition. It is not shaped by another's expectation. It is merely what I have been. There is a stillness between heartbeats, a fraction of time so slight it often goes unnoticed. In that stillness there is neither past nor future, neither triumph nor failure, only suspension. I dwell there now. The river of memory slows. The tide withdraws. If there is anything beyond this moment, it does not announce itself with fanfare. There are no trumpets, no blazing revelations, only quiet. A quiet so complete it feels almost tender. The last thing I relinquish is not pain, nor fear, nor even regret. It is vigilance. And then, at last, I rest. There are places in the world that do not so much exist as persist, and Spinner's End was one such place. Clinging to the edge of a tired river as though reluctant to admit that time had moved on without it. I was born in a narrow brick house whose windows looked upon smoke-stained air and water the color of diluted ink. And from my earliest memory I understood that endurance was the first and only virtue such a place respected. The river did not sparkle, it endured. The mills did not sing, they labored. The houses did not welcome, they contained. Ours was the last in a row of reluctant dwellings, its paint forever peeling, its door forever swollen against the damp, as though even wood might protest the climate of its confinement. Inside, the air held the layered scents of boiled cabbage, old fabric, and something metallic that seemed to emanate from the very pipes. The floorboards complained beneath one's weight, not dramatically, but in low mutters, as if recording every intrusion. I learned quickly how to step where the wood would not betray me, how to move in ways that left no echo. Silence, I discovered, was not merely absence of sound. It was a discipline, a survival skill. My father's temper required it, for noise was often invitation enough for displeasure, and displeasure had a way of expanding until it filled a room. My mother, Eileen Prince, carried silence differently. Upon her it seemed not defensive, but worn, like a garment inherited from a lineage that had frayed long before she did. There were traces of refinement in her posture, in the precise way she folded linens or measured tea leaves, gestures that did not belong to Spinner's End and yet had been exiled there. She rarely spoke of her family, but when she did, it was in tones that suggested both loyalty and distance, as though the name Prince were a portrait turned toward the wall. I gleaned from her fragments that once there had been halls lit by wandlight rather than gas, shelves of books bound in dragonhide, and a lineage that prided itself on magical subtlety rather than spectacle. Such things had diminished long before my birth, eroded by choices unapproved and alliances unblessed. Decline, I learned, does not arrive with fanfare. It settles gradually, like soot. My father did not understand that world and would not have respected it had he been capable of understanding. Tobias Snape valued what could be held, spent, or consumed. Magic, to him, was neither miracle nor inheritance. It was inconvenient when my mother's wand lay upon the mantel. He regarded it as one might regard an ornament too fragile for daily use, neither admiring nor despising it, but mistrusting the implications of its presence. Arguments between them rarely rose to theatrical heights. They simmered instead, a constant low boil that infused the house with tension. I learned to read the tilt of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the angle at which he removed his coat. These were portents more reliable than weather. The river behind our house became my refuge, not because it was beautiful, but because it was indifferent. I would sit upon its bank, the damp seeping through the knees of my trousers, and watch how it accepted everything cast into its leaves. Scraps of paper, the occasional bottle without altering its course. The water did not protest contamination. It bore it. There was a lesson there, though I could not have articulated it at the time. To endure without outward complaint. To carry what one must, and continue forward. The mills upstream disgorged their refuse without apology, and the river bore it as though it were merely another aspect of existence. I admired that grim steadiness. Magic first stirred within me, not as lightning, but as tremor. A glass rattling upon the kitchen table when my father's voice rose too sharply. A cupboard door that refused to remain open when I willed it shut with more intensity than my small hands could muster. These incidents were brief and deniable, easily attributed to faulty hinges or uneven floors, yet I felt in them a current that ran beneath the visible world. It was not exuberant. It did not erupt in sparks or showers of light. It gathered instead in quiet concentrations, responding to emotion as a tide responds to the moon. My mother noticed. Of course, she noticed everything, though she seldom remarked upon it. One evening, when my father had retreated into a sullen silence and the lamps cast elongated shadows along the walls, she sat beside me at the narrow table and placed her hand over mine. Her fingers were cool and thin, yet steady. "Control," she murmured, not looking at me directly, as though addressing the air between us. "Magic is will shaped into form. Without control, it shapes you." That was the first lesson she gave me, and it contained within it the essence of all that followed. Magic was not release, it was discipline. From her, I learned of wand woods and cores, of incantations that had survived centuries, because they aligned with deeper currents than language alone could command. She spoke of Hogwarts, not with nostalgia, but with measured recollection, as though describing a structure both magnificent and flawed. The founders, she explained, had each impressed upon the castle their particular philosophy ambition coiled beneath the lake. Intellect spiraling in towers, courage echoing in corridors, loyalty warming the kitchens below. These were not merely abstract virtues. They were temperaments, embedded in stone. I would one day feel them in the very air I breathed. But then they were distant, almost mythical. Our house in Spinner's End seemed the antithesis of such grandeur. Its ceilings were low, its windows reluctant to admit light, yet even there magic insinuated itself into the cracks. I practiced in secrecy, coaxing small changes from stubborn objects. A thread drawn through fabric without needle, a page turning at my unspoken request. Each success brought not elation but satisfaction, the quiet pleasure of competence. Power, I discovered, was less intoxicating than mastery. To know that one could effect change precisely without a spectacle, that was the allure. It was during one of those long, muted summers that I first observed the Evans sisters. Their house stood a short distance from ours, distinguished only by curtains of a slightly brighter hue, and a garden that made modest attempts at cheerfulness. I had seen them before, of course, but observation is not the same as attention. Attention alters the air around a person. The younger of the Tully moved with a curious lightness, as though gravity held a less binding contract with her. There were moments when a flower would tilt improbably toward her, or a swing would arc higher than the push warranted. I recognized the signs with the certainty of kinship. I did not approach her immediately. There is vulnerability in revelation, and I had long ago learned caution. Instead, I watched from the margins, cataloguing evidence. When at last I spoke, it was not with flourish, but with precision. I told her what she was, before she had words for it. A witch. The term did not frighten her. It intrigued her. That difference marked the boundary between us and her sister, whose disdain manifested swiftly and without restraint. Petunia's eyes narrowed not from fear, but from exclusion. Magic, to her, was theft of normalcy, of attention, of belonging. With Lily, however, magic was discovery. She did not conceal her delight when petals trembled at her gesture, or when a branch bent lower to accommodate her climb. She laughed, not loudly, but freely. I found in that sound something unfamiliar, warmth unaccompanied by calculation. Our conversations unfolded in the unremarkable spaces between houses, upon grass that struggled to remain green. I explained to her the statute of secrecy, the existence of a hidden world layered over the mundane like a palimpsest. She listened as though I were unveiling a treasure map. In truth, I was mapping myself. Possessed a quality I would later struggle to recapture: suspension. Time did not press forward with the same insistence. The mills continued their grinding labor, my father his brooding routines, my mother her quiet endurance, yet in the narrow corridor of shared knowledge Lily and I carved, there existed an interval untouched by resentment. She asked questions without mockery. She accepted answers without suspicion. To be believed without proof is a rare gift. I did not yet know how fragile such intervals are. Within our house, tension accumulated as steadily as dust. My father's dissatisfaction was not explosive. It was pervasive. He resented what he could not name and distrusted what he could not control. My mother's restraint, once perhaps a choice, hardened into habit. Words unspoken gathered like sediment. I learned to withdraw further, to invest my energy in study rather than confrontation. Books, when I could acquire them, became my allies. From my mother's old-school texts, I gleaned principles of potion-making, discovering in their measured instructions a solace absent from domestic life. A potion did not shout. It responded predictably to care or negligence. Its outcome was the sum of deliberate actions. There was justice in that. Potion-making, even in theory, revealed to me a truth that would guide my future. Transformation requires patience. Ingredients must be prepared with precision, added in sequence, stirred according to rhythm rather than impulse. Too much heat ruins subtlety. Too little leaves potential unrealized. The metaphor did not escape me. If magic was will shaped into form, then potions were will moderated by discipline. In their pages I found not merely recipes, but philosophy. Evenings often concluded with raised voices muffled by thin walls. I would retreat to the small room at the top of the house, my room where the ceiling slanted and the wallpaper peeled at the corners. There, by the dim light of a lamp that flickered as though uncertain of its duty, I would trace incantations upon scraps of parchment, refining movements of wrist and breath. Wandless magic is difficult, wandless control more so. Yet necessity sharpens focus. I had no intention of being powerless in any realm available to me. It would be facile to claim that I despised my father. Children are more complex in their loyalties than that. I feared him, certainly. I resented the unpredictability of his temper, the way it bent the atmosphere of a room. Yet I also observed him with a detachment bordering on study. He was a man diminished by circumstance, laboring in a world that offered little acknowledgment. His frustration sought outlay, and lacking safer channels, it found us. This does not excuse, it explains. Explanation has always held greater appeal for me than condemnation. As summer waned and the promise of Hogwarts approached, anticipation settled upon me like a second skin. The letter, when it arrived, bore the crest my mother had described in muted tones: lion, serpent, raven, badger, intertwined. I ran my fingers over the parchment, feeling in its texture the weight of inevitability. My father regarded it with narrowed eyes, my mother with something dangerously close to longing. "You will do well," she said, though whether it was encouragement or invocation I could not determine. In the days that followed, I walked often to the river, contemplating departure. Spinner's End had shaped me in ways I did not yet fully comprehend. Its narrowness had honed my perception. Its tension had cultivated restraint. I did not imagine Hogwarts as salvation. I imagined it as arena, a place where ambition would find structure, where knowledge would be currency, and where the disciplines I had cultivated in obscurity might finally meet resistance worthy of them. On my last evening before departure, Lily and I stood again upon the patch of grass that had borne witness to our shared discoveries. She spoke of trains and houses and possibilities with an eagerness untempered by apprehension. I listened, measuring her enthusiasm against my own more guarded anticipation. We would enter the same world, yet I sensed even then that we would not inhabit it identically. Differences, subtle as they were, had already begun to root. The house behind me loomed as it always, had brick unadorned, windows reflecting little. I looked at it not with affection, nor with bitterness, but with acknowledgment. It had been crucible rather than cradle. Within its narrow confines, I had learnt silence, discipline, observation. I had learnt that magic without control is chaos, and that power unshaped is waste. I had learned to endure. Spinner's End did not release me with ceremony. The river continued its slow procession. The mills exhaled their smoke. My father spoke little. My mother pressed into my hand a wand that had once been hers, its wood worn smooth by years of cautious use. "Remember," she said, and in that single word lay instruction, warning, and hope entwined. I remember, and thus the house at Spinner's End receded behind me, not as a wound, but as foundation uneven, perhaps unshadowed, yet integral. One does not escape one's origin, one carries it, as the river carries its sediment, shaping and being shaped in turn. Hogwarts awaited, with its ancient corridors and embedded philosophies. Yet the boy who approached it was forged in narrower halls. In the stillness of that final night, lying beneath a ceiling that slanted like a question, I listened to the muted sounds of the house settling around me. The pipes ticked, the floorboards sighed. Beyond the window, the river persisted. I did not know then how often I would revisit this place in memory, how its shadows would inform my choices long after I had exchanged brick for stone. I knew only that departure does not erase, it layers, and in that layering, identity takes shape. There is a particular quality to departure that no incantation can replicate: the thinning of air. a stretching of time, as though the world itself hesitates before permitting the severing of one chapter from the next. The morning we left for London carried that quality in abundance. Spinner's End lay damp beneath a reluctant sky, its brick terraces unchanged, unimpressed by trunks packed and futures unfolding. The river moved with its habitual indifference. Only I seemed aware that something irreversible had begun. My mother accompanied me to the station. My father did not. He had muttered something about obligations and shifts, though whether that was truth or excuse, I neither knew nor pursued. The absence did not wound. It merely confirmed expectation. My mother's hand rested lightly upon my sleeve as we walked, her touch measured, as though she feared either clutching too tightly or releasing too soon. King's Cross was louder than any place I had known. Steam exhaled in white sighs from engines. Voices overlapped in impatience. Footsteps struck stone with urgent rhythm. For a moment I felt small not in stature, but in certainty. Spinner's End had been narrow, but it had been comprehensible. This was scale without intimacy. Platform 9 3/4, my mother murmured, her composure intact despite the tremor I sensed beneath it. Walk straight at the barrier between 9 and 10. Do not hesitate, I nodded. Hesitation, after all, invites collision. We approached the barrier. For an instant, the ordinary world pressed in families, bustling, porters shouting, metal clanging. Then, with deliberate stride, I stepped forward. There is a peculiar sensation when one passes through concealment, charm into revelation, not unlike stepping through cool water into warmer current. The barrier dissolved, and the sound altered. The cacophony shifted into something more layered, more alive with purpose. The scarlet engine stood gleaming beneath arched ironwork, steam curling like breath in anticipation. Students clustered in uneven groups, robes new and stiff, trunks stacked haphazardly. Owls blinked from cages, cats threaded between ankles. The air hummed not merely with noise, but with possibility. Hogwarts Express. I had imagined it many times, yet imagination, I discovered, lacks the density of reality. The train was not mythic. It was solid, smelling faintly of coal and polished brass, and yet it signified passage into a realm layered invisibly over the one I had known. My mother paused before the carriage door. "Remember what you have learned," she said softly. The words were simple but weighted. Control, discipline, observation. "I will," I replied. There are farewells that fracture and farewells that fold inward. Ours folded. She did not weep. She did not embrace me with theatrical fervor. She placed her hand briefly against my cheek, then withdrew. "Right," she added. I boarded. The corridor within the carriage was narrow. Compartments already filling with clusters of voices. I moved past laughter and introductions, seeking not companionship but vantage. It was habit, yet before I could select solitude, a familiar voice cut through the din. Severus. Lily stood halfway down the carriage, her hair brighter beneath filtered sunlight, her expression alight with that same unguarded eagerness I had come to expect. She waved, unconcerned with dignity or restraint. I felt the faintest tightening at the corner of my mouth's expression that, in another, might have been called a smile. "You found it," she said as I joined her. "Obviously," I replied, though the dryness lacked its usual edge. She had secured a compartment already occupied by a round-faced boy whose eyes shimmered with barely contained tears. His trunk bore the marks of having been packed and repacked with anxious care. He looked up as we entered, attempting composure. "I'm Neville," he offered, voice wobbling. "Severus," I said. "Lily." Introductions concluded. Silence settled briefly, punctuated by the rhythmic hiss of steam outside. Lily took the seat opposite mine, leaning forward as though proximity might accelerate arrival. "Can you believe it?" she whispered, though the compartment was hardly private. "Yes," I said. It was inevitable. She laughed lightly. "You make everything sound like destiny. Everything is consequence," I corrected. The train lurched into motion with a shudder that rippled through floor and bone alike. Outside, London blurred, brick giving way to green. I felt something loosen within monot relief. Precisely, but transition acknowledged. It was not long before the compartment door slid open without invitation. Two boys stood framed in the corridor, their presence immediately altering the air. One possessed unruly, dark hair and an expression of casual confidence. The other, taller, with a languid posture that suggested habitual amusement. "We're looking for an empty compartment," the dark-haired boy announced, gaze sweeping us with cursory assessment. "There isn't one here," I replied coolly. He seemed not to hear the dismissal. His attention had fixed upon Lily. "I'm James," he said, offering the name as though it required no embellishment. "James Potter." "Sirius Black," the taller added, leaning against the door frame with affected indifference. The surname did not escape me. Black, an old pure-blood lineage, steeped in tradition and expectation. My mother had mentioned them once, with a tone that mixed respect and critique. I wondered what such a name was doing, paired with such careless posture. "Lily Evans," she said brightly. "Severus Snape," I added, though my own name carried less immediate impact. James' eyes flicked toward me then, assessing. There was something in his expression and impatience with what did not immediately entertain him. "Snape, is it?" he repeated, as though testing unfamiliar texture. I inclined my head slightly. "Potter." The exchange was civil. It was also charged. We were just discussing houses, Lily interjected, sensing perhaps the undercurrent. Do you know which one you want? Gryffindor, James answered without hesitation. Of course, Sirius drawled. Anything else would be a tragedy. And you? James asked, turning to Lily. I don't know, she admitted. Maybe Gryffindor. A flicker brief, unguarded, crossed my thoughts. Slytherin would be better, I said evenly. James' expression sharpened. Slytherin. He pronounced the name as though it were faintly distasteful. I'd leave, wouldn't you? He added too serious. Sirius smirked. My whole family's been in Slytherin. Suppose I'd break tradition or fulfill it, I observed quietly. He studied me then with renewed interest. You sound as though you admire it. I admire ambition, I replied, and resourcefulness. And cunning, James added, if properly directed. Lily shifted slightly in her seat. There's nothing wrong with ambition, she said. James shrugged, unconvinced. If you like that sort of thing. The conversation might have remained trivial had tone not intervened. There are inflections that wound more effectually than insults. James' dismissal was not overt, it was casual. And casual disdain, I have found, often cuts deepest. Perhaps, I said, voice cooled further. You prefer recklessness. Sirius sparked a laugh. James' eyes narrowed fractionally. The compartment, small as it was, seemed suddenly narrower. Come on, Sirius said lightly, sensing escalation. Plenty of other compartments. They withdrew, laughter trailing behind them like challenge. Neville exhaled audibly once the door slid shut. Lily frowned faintly. You didn't have to, they initiated. I interrupted. It was just talk, she replied gently. Talk reveals inclination, I countered. She studied me with that expression she reserved for moments when she suspected I was building walls unnecessarily. You always assume the worst. I assume patterns, I said. Outside, countryside unfolded in widening expanses of green and gold. The train's rhythm settled into steady cadence, like pulse beneath skin. Within the compartment, quiet returned, though not quite the same quiet as before. Something had shifted, not yet fracture, but tension introduced. As hours passed, the corridor filled intermittently with passing students. Names and lineages drifted through half-open doors. I listened more than I spoke, cataloguing surnames, accents, alliances forming in embryonic form. Hogwarts had not yet been reached, and already its social architecture was assembling. Lily, meanwhile, remained animated, speculating about classes and teachers, about floating candles and enchanted ceilings. Her excitement did not diminish. It radiated. I found myself watching her more than the passing landscape. noting how light from the window caught in her hair, how her hands moved when she spoke of possibility. It occurred to me, fleetingly, that whatever house claimed her would be altered by her presence. Dusk approached gradually, sky bleeding into violet. The train began to slow. A murmur rippled through compartments, anticipation thickening. I felt my spine straighten, as though instinctively bracing for evaluation. Sorting was not mere ceremony. It was classification. Placement among peers whose temperaments would either sharpen or dull one's own. The train ground to a halt. Doors slid open. Cool air rushed in, scented faintly of lake and distant forest. We stepped down onto a dimly lit platform where a towering figure with a lantern called first years to gather. His silhouette loomed large against flickering light. Across the water, I glimpsed it Hogwarts, rising from darkness, windows aglow like watchful eyes. Towers pierced the night, reflections trembling upon the lake's surface. For a moment, even I felt the pull of awe. Lily inhaled sharply beside me. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yes," I said, though my tone held more analysis than wonder. Stone carries memory. Those walls had witnessed century. They would witness us. We boarded small boats that skimmed across black water. The castle grew larger with each silent stroke. I felt, beneath anticipation, a familiar thread of resolve tightening. Spinner's End had forged into winds. The train compartment had introduced rivalry. The castle had promised a reign. As we approached the shore, lantern light casting gold upon stone steps, I understood something with quiet certainty. The journey had not merely transported us through distance, but into divergence. Compartments had opened and closed. Names had been exchanged. Allegiances had begun to sketch themselves in faint outline. And though Lily sat only a few feet away in that rocking boat, illuminated by reflected starlight, I sensed already that proximity does not guarantee permanence. The water lapped softly against stone. The doors opened, and we stepped forward. Life within the stone walls of Hogwarts unfolded with a weight and persistence that both fascinated and unnerved me. The castle existed as a living archive, its corridors saturated with centuries of intention, its towers and staircases echoing the philosophies of founders whose influence persisted in subtle, almost imperceptible currents. Every stone seemed to hum with expectations, not of the present, but of what those who came before had demanded of those who would follow. The air was thick with latent power, capable of shaping thought, bending temperament, and rewarding attentiveness with knowledge that had long ceased to be accessible by ordinary means. It was a realm that did not simply house students. It disciplined them, tested them, and pressed upon them the inevitability of consequence. Within that crucible, ambition became a tangible force, something to measure, cultivate, and occasionally temper, like a potion whose potency could both heal and corrode. Slytherin House was a chamber beneath the lake, perpetually damp with cold reflected from water above, its walls lined with green and silver banners that seemed to pulse with inherited expectation. The common room was more than shelter. It was a vessel for temperament. Here one learned the subtle art of observation, noting the priorities and weaknesses of others, cataloguing actions with an analytical rigor honed by necessity rather than friendship. Silence was currency. A measured word or glance could carry greater influence than a shouted proclamation. I spent hours alone with my thoughts, tracing the architecture of power within the house, seeing patterns in behavior as clearly as I might trace lines upon parchment. In these hours, ambition revealed itself as both burden and instrument, the means by which one might survive and perhaps thrive, in a world that valued mastery above sentiment. Potions became my anchor. The cauldrons, the ingredients, the precise choreography of heat and sturchy element demanded unwavering attention. In potion making, I discovered the intersection of control and transformation, an almost literal manifestation of the principle that mastery required patience and calculation. The smallest misalignment of timing or measure could ruin an entire mixture, producing nothing more than failure, a lesson repeated with frustrating insistence by ingredients and cauldrons alike. I found in these meticulous practices a reflection of broader ambition, to shape outcomes according to one's design rather than allow circumstance to dictate results. Every simmering potion was a laboratory for self-discipline, every tincture a mirror for the temperament required to endure, to manipulate, and eventually to dominate. The larger world beyond Slytherin was not absent, though its influence was filtered and abstracted. Gryffindor's boldness, Hufflepuff's patience, Ravenclaw's analytical fervor, they all operated as counterweights, subtle yet pervasive teaching lessons that I would carry in silence. The founders' philosophies extended beyond their respective houses, and the castle, as custodian, ensured these principles persisted. Ambition was tested not in isolation, but in interaction with contrasting forces. Observation became essential. Strategy emerged not from desire alone, but from the synthesis of understanding and restraint. There were those whose talents were raw, unchecked by reflection, and whose failures illuminated the price of untempered impulse. There were those whose cunning lacked foresight, and whose successes were fleeting because they could not see the patterns hidden in plain sight. Magic in this period revealed itself in new dimensions. Spells, once mechanical and rote, became exercises in subtlety and precision. The interaction between intent and outcome was rarely linear, and I learned to account for hidden variables, the emotional undercurrents of those around me, the latent effects of ambient enchantments, the unconscious influence of history encoded in the stones. Each charm cast, each potion brewed, was an experiment not merely in technique, but in understanding cause and consequence on a broader scale. Ambition, therefore, was inseparable from comprehension. To seek power without knowing its parameters was folly. To observe without seeking control was impotence. The two had to coexist. Friendship existed only as a variable, not as comfort. Alliances were instruments, temporary and contingent upon mutual utility. Trust was rationed, extended only where it served a strategic purpose, and withdrawn the instant it threatened autonomy. Loyalty, like affection, was a currency to be deployed judiciously. The house itself enforced this reality, rewarding those who adapted with subtle approval, while punishing those who allowed sentiment to dictate action. Ambition could flourish only within these constraints. Its cultivation was daily, rigorous, almost ritualistic, and required vigilance over both self and outside the walls. The world was not waiting, but it was perceptible through whispers and rumor. The ministry's edicts, the shifting alliances of pure blood families, and the subtle hierarchies that governed magical society offered early lessons in diplomacy and manipulation. To move effectively in that environment, one had to internalize both principle and expediency, to observe the motives of others and anticipate consequence. Hogwarts provided a controlled environment in which to refine these skills, and Slytherin demanded their mastery. The slow, deliberate unfolding of power, measured and enduring, became as intoxicating as it was necessary. Even in solitude, the castle offered instruction. Portraits conversed, not merely to entertain, but to transmit values and warnings. Ghosts drifted through corridors, observing, judging, and occasionally advising. The air was saturated with reminders of mortality and precedent. Every corner contained lessons. Every shadow suggested observations. It was impossible to ignore that ambition. Even nurtured and quiet would always intersect with consequence. That mastery was inseparable from the weight of expectation, and that failure, though often subtle, was inevitable when complacency intruded. By the end of my first year, the shape of my ambition had solidified. It was neither impulsive nor openly visible. It was a quiet accumulation, a precise calibration of effort, knowledge, and foresight. I understood that power must be cultivated patiently, subtly, like a potion left to mature over months, attended only when necessary, but never neglected. My temperament had been honed by necessity, my skills refined by discipline, my observation sharpened by isolation. Hogwarts had not given me magic. It had given me context. Slytherin had not merely housed me. It had instructed me. I began to understand with an almost tactile clarity that the acquisition of influence was inseparable from control of self, that knowledge without restraint was dangerous, and that subtlety was frequently more potent than force. The castle, the lake above, the stones beneath my hands, they were all teachers, in ways that no lecture or spellbook could replicate. Ambition, properly shaped, was not hunger alone. It was observation, patience, calculation, and endurance. It was the invisible scaffolding upon which one might build not merely a reputation, but a life resistant to interference, capable of shaping outcomes with precision. By candlelight in the Slytherin common room, I traced lines in a notebook, charting potions and formulas, cross-referencing spells and theories, observing the reactions of peers and professors alike. The hum of the house beneath the lake was a steady undertone, an ever-present reminder that legacy and expectation endure, even in silence. Ambition, I realized, is neither loud nor visible. It is sediment, accumulating slowly, shaping the foundation of what one will eventually become. In that quiet, I began the work of becoming. The castle at night was different from its daytime self, less a school than a labyrinth of memory and latent intention. Hallways that had seemed orderly and static in daylight revealed themselves as living pathways. Corridors that shifted subtly, not merely in their architecture but in the currents of sound, shadow, and expectation. The stone walls absorbed footsteps, whispers, and the rhythm of breathing, distorting them in ways that required constant awareness. Every echo carried information. Every flicker of torchlight cast shape upon walls that might conceal or reveal, depending upon attentiveness. I walked these corridors with careful measure, noting intersections, listening for the faintest irregularities. It was practice in observation, an exercise in both patience and preemptive calculation. The castle taught vigilance as inexorably as it taught magic. Slytherin Tower, isolated yet strategically positioned, offered a vantage that few other houses afforded. From windows, one could glimpse stretches of lake, its black surface reflecting stars with a deceptive calm. Moonlight pooled in hallways and stairwells, emphasizing uneven stone, worn edges, and subtle inclines. Shadows clung differently to different corners, shaped by unseen enchantments and centuries of residual energy. In these hours, I understood more about the castle's nature than I did in the busy daytime, when students' energy and noise masked its subtler lessons. The night revealed structure and intent, demonstrated that space itself could be measured, manipulated, and employed to advantage. In these corridors, encounters with peers were seldom neutral. Relationships emerged in the form of assessments, alliances, and subtle competitions. Observation revealed tendencies, weaknesses, and latent potential. Every glance, every choice of path, every tone of voice became data to catalog. Even the most casual interactions carried significance. Gryffindor students moved with recklessness, Hufflepuff with predictable kindness, Ravenclaw with intellectual precision. Each temperament influenced how one might navigate encounters, when to act and when to defer. The skill lay in perceiving patterns beneath superficial behavior, in anticipating consequences before they arrived. Ambition, properly directed, required such foresight. Magic in the corridors operated differently than in classrooms. Wandless effects often persisted longer here, residual traces of charms, curses, and enchantments left by those who had passed before. A broom that leaned slightly against a wall might shift subtly as one approached. A tapestry might ripple, not from draught, but from intent encoded into its fibers. Awareness of these subtle currents became essential, for miscalculation could attract unwanted attention or reveal unpreparedness. Here, subtlety surpassed power. Precision mattered more than force. I practiced control over both effect and perception, refining instinct into method. The shadowed hours also revealed opportunities for strategic observation of peers and professors. Faculty footsteps could be tracked in advance, their habits catalogued, patterns of teaching, grading, and movement, exposed vulnerabilities and strengths. First-year students, eager and naive, moved with predictable overconfidence or hesitation. Older students demonstrated complex interactions, often masking intent behind displays of bravado. I recorded these lessons mentally, as meticulously as I traced formulas in the dungeon for potion preparation. Each observation was a building block for future advantage, though its value was often intangible at the time. Certain corridors contained lingering echoes of history, areas where magic had been exercised with intensity, leaving the stone saturated with residual influence. Such places required caution. Wand movement here could trigger effects unintended or unseen, releasing dormant enchantments or summoning echoes of spells cast long ago. The castle itself was an active participant. interacting with those who moved through it with subtle, often imperceptible judgment. Learning to interpret these currents became a skill in its own right, one that demanded patience and constant vigilance. Solitude in the night corridors provided moments for reflection, contemplation, and calculation. Here, I considered the lessons of my upbringing, the influence of Spinner's End, and the emerging patterns of power around me. Each year at Hogwarts deepened understanding that influence and survival were inseparable from knowledge of environment, mastery over self, and comprehension of others' tendencies. The castle, by virtue of its history and design, accelerated this awareness, exposing the subtle architecture of interaction and consequence. Evenings in the dungeons offered similar instruction. Potion ingredients emitted faint odors, cauldrons shimmered with latent heat, and shelves held centuries of accumulated knowledge. The mixture of night corridors and dungeon laboratories reinforced the principle that ambition required simultaneous cultivation of intellect, skill, and perception. Power without awareness was vulnerability. Mastery without foresight was incomplete. The castle's rhythms, both in its sound and its structure, served as a persistent tutor, shaping behavior almost unconsciously. By the end of these early nights, it became clear that Hogwarts functioned as more than a school. It was a test, a lens that magnified weakness and rewarded precision, a place where the disciplined could cultivate advantage and the inattentive would falter. The castle did not reward enthusiasm or courage alone. It demanded observation, reflection, and a careful application of skill. Shadows were both threat and opportunity, teaching that true control required awareness of that which others overlooked. And so I moved within the corridors with deliberate attention, cataloging, anticipating, learning. The castle offered lessons in endurance, strategy, and subtlety. The quiet hours of observation shaped my understanding of power, of consequence, and of ambition. The stone walls and shadowed passages did not simply contain students, they instructed, measured, and influenced them. In this environment, I honed patience and precision, developing a mastery of circumstance that extended beyond wand, spell, or potion. The castle, in its unassuming rigor, demanded nothing less than the full cultivation of mind, skill, and intent. By the time the moon had passed its apex, I had internalized another truth, that every corridor, every shadow, every whisper was a vector of opportunity, waiting to be understood, manipulated, and employed. Knowledge and awareness were tools as potent as any spell. Ambition, sustained and calculated, could shape reality when exercised with careful attention. Hogwarts offered instruction beyond the classroom, lessons in movement, observation, and restraint that no textbook could provide. In the silence of corridors, I began to see the intricate lattice of influence and the role I might occupy within it. Hogwarts, beneath its enchantments and centuries of tradition, functioned as a complex lattice of relationships, obligations, and subtle influence. The castle's walls preserved not only history but the invisible architecture of social hierarchy. Every interaction, every choice of companionship carried consequence. Yet, beneath these outward alignments, the currents of ambition and temperament often diverged, creating tensions invisible to the casual observer, but evident to those attuned to subtleties. The first year demonstrated this principle clearly. Lineage, personality, and choice revealed far more. Observation extended beyond idle scrutiny, becoming a disciplined exercise in prediction and calculation. I catalogued alliances forming across houses, noting the subtleties of interaction, the quiet negotiations, the flickers of attention or avoidance that presaged influence. The castle amplified these dynamics, rewarding foresight and punishing neglect. Ambition thrived where intellect met perception. Alliances, fragile yet vital, were tested continuously. Trust was neither granted nor assumed. It was assessed through action, speech, and subtle demonstration of capability. Observing these dynamics, I learned that influence depended less on power itself than on the careful cultivation of perception. Magic reinforced the calculus of alliances. Discrete displays of skill served as markers of capability. Students who mismanaged emotion were easy to predict. Those who masked it effectively became far more subtle and dangerous. Observation, when paired with skill, yielded insight into both immediate and potential future leverage. The professors, too, became variables. Awareness of these patterns allowed careful navigation of academic and social spheres. Demonstrating capability without arrogance became an essential strategy. Overreach or visible impatience invited scrutiny. Outside Slytherin, interactions with students from other houses reinforced the dynamics of competition and strategy. And Ravenclaw's intellectual pursuit each required calibrated responses. Direct confrontation was rarely necessary. Strategic restraint, observation, and controlled engagement often yielded greater advantage. In these exchanges, early lessons in patience and calculation proved essential. Ambition was never reckless. It was methodical, guided by observation and tempered by anticipation. Magic itself mirrored these principles. Wand work, spells, and potion-making were not merely tools of power, but instruments of precision. A charm cast carelessly could betray intent. A potion misapplied could undermine credibility. Each action became part of a larger calculus, a demonstration of skill and strategic awareness. Power untempered by calculation was wasted. Influenced untested by observation was fragile. Potential allies and adversaries assessed. Even minor misjudgments, hesitation in speech, delayed action, poorly controlled emotion, had measurable consequences. The development of foresight, the ability to anticipate reactions and counter-reactions, became as vital as proficiency in spell work or potion making. Through all this, Lily remained a constant, though her influence on the environment differed from mine. Observation of her interactions, both conscious and unconscious, reinforced understanding that influence could manifest without calculation. The contrast between instinctive sway and methodical leverage became apparent. Her lightness illuminated patterns in the behavior of others, highlighting variables I might otherwise have overlooked. Each corridor, classroom, and common room contributed to a living matrix of potential alliances, rivalries, and influence. Observation, patience, and calculated action became inseparable from both skill and ambition. Survival, mastery, and eventual dominance depended upon understanding these patterns, integrating skill and perception, and exercising foresight with disciplined rigor. It was measured, persistent, and contingent upon context. Influence required both precision and patience, and every alliance, whether temporary, strategic, or enduring, represented a variable in the larger design of progress. Hogwarts, in all its grandeur and subtle menace, provided the framework for understanding that power is not seized but cultivated, not declared but demonstrated, and not given but earned through observation, discipline, and the relentless application of calculated action. By the third year, the corridors of Hogwarts had become a network not only of passage but of meaning. It had become necessity, a discipline interwoven with every action, every decision, every silent evaluation of those around me. A shift in torchlight, a tremor in the air, that required constant attention. The walls themselves, it seemed, were alive with memory, recording behaviors and responding to those capable of perceiving them. Within Slytherin, the hierarchy of ambition became increasingly complex. Peer relationships, once nascent and tentative, now exhibited intricate patterns of dominance, alliance, and rivalry. These lessons, though social in appearance, mirrored the precision required in the dungeons or laboratories. Knowledge without strategy was inert. Power without context was vulnerable. The common room, often perceived as merely a gathering space, functioned instead as a microcosm of the broader world, a testing ground for influence, negotiation, and control. Magic intersected with these social calculations in subtle ways, could shift perception and realign hierarchies without overt confrontation. Potion-making, wand work, and charms became exercises in both skill and persuasion. The effects were not merely functional but also psychological. Mastery of these disciplines signaled competence, discipline, and potential qualities noticed by peers and faculty alike. Even failures, when contained and analyzed, could reveal insight into both personal limits and the behavior of others. Observation became essential for learning not only technique, but the patterns of power embedded in every interaction. Pouch Slytherin, the dynamics of interhouse relations demanded constant attention. Every glance, posture, and word was data. Every casual remark, a potential indicator of intent. The castle provided abundant opportunity for such analysis. Shared corridors, mealtime gatherings, and open courtyards revealed more about inclination and character than formal lessons ever could. The professors themselves remained variables in the complex equation of perception. Each carried bias, preference, and habit into their action. Recognizing patterns of evaluation and response allowed the anticipation of outcomes, both in classroom performance and broader interaction. Control over presentation, tone, timing, subtlety of demonstration became a form of influence, shaping impression as effectively as skill. Hogwarts, in its complexity, required simultaneous mastery of both the tangible and the intangible, spells, potions, and charms, coexisting with awareness, calculation, and strategic deployment of observation. Even in solitude, the environment provided instruction. Shadows moved differently in empty corridors. Residual enchantments left traces that could be read by a careful observer. The castle recorded actions, sometimes subtly influencing future occurrences, providing both warnings and opportunities. Mastery required awareness of these latent effects, and the ability to integrate them into deliberate strategy. Each night, walking the corridors, or lingering in the common room, after others had retreated, I noted patterns in light, sound, and residual magical influence, cataloging them mentally as lessons for future use. By the end of the 3rd year, the integration of observation and action had begun to define my approach to Hogwarts. Knowledge of environment, awareness of peer and faculty tendencies, and control of personal behavior formed a unified methodology for navigating both opportunity and threat. Magic alone was insufficient. Only when paired with perception and anticipation did it become effective. Influence emerged not from displays of power, but from subtle orchestration of circumstance, from understanding the architecture of intention embedded within the castle and its inhabitants. The calculus of alliances, refined over the preceding years, now extended to prediction of consequence, both immediate and long-term. Strategic restraint became as valuable as skill and understanding patterns of desire and fear within peers, offered pathways to leverage without confrontation. Ambition remained guided by principle, but tempered with calculation, observation, and patience. Each interaction, each decision, was evaluated not in isolation, but as part of a larger lattice of influence and opportunity. By the close of this period, I had come to recognize a fundamental truth. Power is inseparable from awareness, and influence is inseparable from subtlety. Hogwarts, through structure, tradition, and latent magic, demanded mastery of both. Observation was no longer a tool. It had become an extension of self, an instrument of agency, shaping thought, action, and outcome. The castle's lessons extended far beyond wandwork and potion, embedding a framework for understanding human behavior, strategic manipulation, and the enduring necessity of patience in pursuit of ambition. In silence and shadow, walking beneath torchlight and listening to the subtle pulse of the stone walls, the principle became clear: to endure, to shape, and ultimately to prevail. One must see beyond immediate perception, integrate knowledge with anticipation, and act with precision. Hogwarts taught this with quiet insistence, and I had learned with meticulous care to listen. The 4th year brought with it an expansion of perception, a broadening of both environment and consequence. Hogwarts, already complex, revealed subtleties previously unnoticed, as if the castle itself had waited for attentiveness to reach a certain threshold before disclosing its deeper structures. Staircases shifted not only in position but in nuance. Corridors carried residual traces of enchantment long dormant, and the timing of light and shadow created rhythms that suggested intent rather than coincidence. Observation became both map and compass, a method of orienting oneself not merely within space, but within the ever-evolving lattice of influence and potential. Every corridor, every step, every echo contained information. The challenge lay in perceiving it accurately, integrating it swiftly, and deploying it advantageously. Interaction with peers continued to follow principles I had long observed. Alliances were contingent, rivalries were signals, and the consequences of each choice were rarely immediate, but always accruing. Patterns emerged in predictable sequences. Gryffindor's boldness tended toward impulsive confrontation. Ravenclaw's intellectual pride produced vulnerability to subtle misdirection, and Hufflepuff's diligence often masked latent capacity for influence if properly nurtured. Within Slytherin, alignment shifted according to both perception and opportunity, and trust remained a measured currency. Every encounter, every glance or gesture had potential to reinforce or undermine standing. Awareness of these currents became second nature, and the ability to act within them with calculated restraint grew increasingly vital. Magic itself assumed new forms of complexity. Spells were no longer executed solely for effect. Their timing, context, and subtle variation became as significant as technique. Potions demanded not merely precision, but anticipation, the ability to predict chemical interaction, environmental influence, and the potential for unintended magical resonance. Wand work required an awareness of ambient enchantments, the residual memory of prior spells, and the emotional currents of those nearby. Mastery, I had learned, was never absolute. It was iterative, responsive, and contingent upon observation. Each success informed strategy. Each failure offered insight into consequence, both immediate and projected. Outside the confines of Slytherin, the patterns of alliance and rivalry had grown more intricate. Inter-house dynamics revealed previously hidden levers of influence, whispered suggestions, subtle mimicry of behavior, and strategic placement within shared spaces could all shift perception without overt action. Control of impression became as important as control of skill. Subtle demonstration of competence, patience, or restraint often achieved more than direct confrontation. Hogwarts, in its layered architecture, presented constant opportunity to refine these methods, to integrate observation with strategy, and to anticipate outcomes with greater precision. The faculty, now increasingly familiar in temperament and expectation, provided a further dimension to strategic calculus. Patterns of evaluation, preference, and tolerance were discernible through careful attention to detail, a raised eyebrow, a slight hesitation in response, or the timing of a correction revealed underlying priorities and thresholds of attention. Leveraging this knowledge required patience and subtlety, demonstrating competence while avoiding overreach. Influence was not imposed but accrued, a function of observation, measured action, and careful management of perception. Residual magic within the castle continued to teach lessons through its subtle currents. Wandless disturbances, lingering charm effects, and echoes of prior events produced both caution and opportunity. Interpreting these signals demanded refinement of perception, the ability to separate signal from noise, and the integration of observation with intent. Mastery of such subtleties reinforced the understanding that control, influence, and power extended beyond spells and potions to encompass context, environment, and timing. By mid-year, the integration of observation, calculation, and subtle influence had crystallized into a methodology. Patterns in human behavior, magical residues, and environmental response combined into a lattice of foresight, permitting anticipatory action rather than reactive engagement. Alliances and rivalries were navigated not merely as social exercises, but as components of strategy, where timing, perception, and restraint determined outcomes. Ambition, therefore, was inseparable from awareness. The disciplined mind could manipulate circumstance, whereas impatience or misjudgment yielded only vulnerability. Even in isolation, the castle offered instruction. Night corridors, silent laboratories, and deserted common rooms provided both opportunity and challenge. Shadows, residual enchantments, and the cadence of ambient sound offered subtle cues about both space and those who moved within it. These lessons, often imperceptible to the unobservant, revealed the persistent truth. Mastery required integration of observation with action, anticipation with execution, subtlety with precision. Every step, every glance, every hesitation became part of an invisible calculus, shaping both opportunity and risk. By the conclusion of the 4th year, it was clear that Hogwarts functioned not merely as a school of magic, but as a laboratory for strategy, perception, and the cultivation of influence. The patterns of behavior, the rhythms of the castle, and the latent effects of magic had become instruments through which understanding and power could be extended. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Skill alone was insufficient. Only the combination of observation, discipline, calculation, and subtle action permitted effective navigation of this complex environment. Through the repetition of these lessons, a framework emerged. Power and influence were not granted, they were discerned, calculated, and accrued. Observation was both tool and shield. Foresight was both weapon and guise. Hogwarts demanded constant vigilance and deliberate action, and the mastery of its patterns, whether in shadowed corridors or hidden laboratories, determined both survival and advancement. In learning to perceive, to anticipate, and to act with precision, I had begun to understand the architecture not merely of the castle, but of influence itself, a lattice extending beyond stone and spell into the wider world that awaited beyond its walls. By the 5th year, the complexity of Hogwarts had intensified to a degree that was almost tactile. The castle no longer felt merely like a collection of classrooms, staircases, and corridors. It had become a living system, a matrix of interlocking currents that moved in subtle, often imperceptible rhythms. The lessons of prior years, patience, observation, subtlety, and calculation were now indispensable. Every step, every glance, every interaction contributed to the accumulation of information, the shaping of perception, and the positioning of influence. Each space hallway, common room, classroom contained layers of latent energy, residual intent, and encoded precedent, all of which required careful interpretation. Awareness was no longer an advantage. It was a prerequisite for survival and influence. Within Slytherin, the hierarchy had matured into something both visible and invisible. Influence shifted like a tide, sometimes slowly, sometimes with sudden, almost imperceptible accelerations. Peer relationships, while superficially stable, were continually reconfigured by ambition, temperament, and the perception of skill. Those who could read the subtleties of the most effective exercises of influence were invisible, executed in quiet gestures, subtle demonstrations of mastery, and carefully chosen omissions. Trust, rarely given, was continually evaluated and recalibrated based on observed behavior. Magic now required a higher integration with these principles. Wand work, once mechanical, had become a discipline of intention, timing, and context. Spells were executed with awareness of residual enchantments, ambient energies, and emotional currents, all of which could subtly alter outcome. Potion making demanded foresight, calculation, and adaptability. Environmental factors, the sequence of ingredients, and timing of heat, all required consideration, in conjunction with expected and emergent results. Even small deviations, when combined with misread behavior or unnoticed shifts in magical currents, could yield failure, or, conversely, unexpected opportunity. Mastery, therefore, extended beyond technique to encompass perception, anticipation, and the orchestration of context. The interactions with other houses became increasingly intricate. Gryffindor's impulsiveness, Hufflepuff's reliability, and Ravenclaw's intellect each introduced variables that required constant assessment. Predictable tendencies provided opportunities for influence, while deviations demanded recalibration. Observation was the principal tool for navigating these dynamics. Each conversation, every social movement, and every shared experience contributed data to an evolving understanding of both environment and intention. Influence emerged not from force or dominance, but from anticipation, subtle intervention, and the careful shaping of perception. Faculty members remained both guides and variables in the broader system. Patterns of preference, oversight, and discipline could be discerned through attentive observation. Each response, correction, or gesture contained information about thresholds of tolerance, latent bias, and potential leverage. Strategic engagement required careful calibration, demonstrating competence without arrogance, restraint without timidity. Influence, as I had come to understand it, was accrued invisibly, often over months, through continuous, subtle demonstration of skill, patience, and adaptability. The castle itself continued to teach, even in apparent inactivity. Residual enchantments and latent magical currents functioned as both obstacle and instructor. Wandless disturbances, echoes of prior spellwork, and the uneven currents of ambient magic demanded constant vigilance. Interpretation of these phenomena required integration of prior observation, knowledge of magical principles, and anticipation of interaction with others. Each corridor and chamber became a site of study, a microcosm in which attention to detail could yield insight, opportunity, or both. By mid-year, the integration of observation, calculation, and subtle influence had become instinctual. Patterns in peer behavior, residual magical effect, an environmental response coalesced into a lattice through which anticipation and action were refined. Alliances and rivalries were approached as components of strategy rather than emotional attachment. Influence was measured not by immediate response, but by its cumulative effect over time. Patience and restraint were as essential as skill. Impulsive action jeopardized both perception and positioning. Ambition, therefore, was inseparable from foresight. Even in isolation, the castle continued to provide lessons. Nighttime corridors, empty classrooms, and deserted laboratories revealed layers of latent information that the day obscured. Shadows shifted differently, residual magic hummed beneath stone, and the echoes of footsteps conveyed subtle behavioral signals. Mastery required interpreting these currents, integrating observation with action, and exercising foresight alongside skill. Each movement, each decision, each moment of restraint was part of a larger calculus shaping opportunity, perception, and influence. By the conclusion of the 5th year, a principle had crystallized with clarity. Mastery was contingent upon perception, calculation, and the disciplined orchestration of environment, action, and response. Hogwarts functioned as both school and a laboratory, each corridor and chamber a testing ground for strategy, influence, and the cultivation of subtle power. Observation, once a tool, had become a methodology. Foresight had become a form of leverage. Success and survival were inseparable from the ability to anticipate currents of intent, to navigate both visible and hidden forces, and to act with measured precision. In these silent, shadowed corridors, the lessons of Hogwarts were unmistakable. Influence is accumulated, not granted. Awareness is indispensable, and power, tempered with calculation, patience, and subtlety, shapes both opportunity and outcome. Mastery was no longer a goal of technique alone. It was the orchestration of intent, perception, and circumstance, executed with deliberate patience and quiet precision. The 6th year at Hogwarts introduced a subtle tension that was almost imperceptible at first, yet thickened the air in every corridor and classroom. The castle, vast and layered with centuries of influence, seemed to respond to the collective temperament of its inhabitants, amplifying unease while quietly testing endurance and discretion. Shadows lengthened in ways that suggested more than nightfall, and residual enchantments pulsed faintly with the emotional currents of students navigating their emerging power. Observation, now fully instinctive, revealed fractures in both character and allegiance, and the capacity to anticipate those fractures became a measure of advantage. The world within the walls demanded constant awareness, a vigilance that extended beyond magic to include temperament, intent, and subtle social cues. The social architecture of the school had grown increasingly intricate. Alliances were no longer tentative or easily discerned. They had developed layers of expectation, obligation, and manipulation. Each interaction carried dual significance, the surface meaning accessible to casual perception, and the deeper subtext observable only to those attuned to subtleties. Patterns of ambition and rivalry interwove with academic pursuit, magical aptitude, and inherited temperament, forming a lattice of influence that required careful navigation. Every step, glance, and gesture could signal intention, shift perception, or recalibrate existing power dynamics. Survival, mastery, and advancement were inseparable from the ability to interpret these signals and act with precision. Magic continued to reveal complexity beyond mere skill. Wandwork, potion-making, and charms now demanded a fusion of technical mastery and strategic application. The consequences of even minor miscalculations extended beyond immediate effect to include perception, social influence, and latent magical interactions. Residual magic, ambient enchantment, and the interplay of intent produced outcomes that required constant recalibration. Control, discipline, and anticipation were prerequisites for success. Power exercised without awareness risked compromise, while skill, coupled with observation, produced leverage, invisible to those who relied on technique alone. Inter-house dynamics intensified, revealing both opportunity and threat. Gryffindor's boldness became more deliberate, tempered by past missteps. Ravenclaw's intellect sharpened with a subtle undercurrent of competition. Hufflepuff's reliability evolved into strategic utility. Each movement, remark, and response served as both signal and variable in a larger system. The ability to anticipate behavior, measure temperament, and predict consequence became critical. Influence was not exerted through force, but through the orchestration of perception, the careful alignment of circumstance, and the patient exaltation of opportunity. Faculty remained crucial variables in the lattice of control. patterns of evaluation, preference, and tolerance were now fully integrated into strategy. Subtle observation tracking gestures, timing, inflectional anticipation of response, enabling strategic presentation of skill and restraint. Influence accrued invisibly, not through confrontation, but through measured, deliberate action over time. Mastery required awareness of these vectors, an integration of perception, skill, and strategic intent. The castle itself, ever responsive, continued to offer lessons in subtlety and consequence. Night corridors, empty classrooms, and deserted laboratories became sites of study, revealing traces of prior magic and behavioral residue from peers and predecessors. Interpretation of these residual currents required integration of observation, experience, and foresight. Each shadow, echo, and flicker was data to be assimilated, a signal to be understood, a variable in the larger calculus of influence and strategy. By mid-year, the capacity to integrate observation with anticipatory action had become fully reflexive. Patterns of behavior, latent magical influence. An environmental response combined into an ongoing assessment of opportunity and risk. Alliances and rivalries were navigated as strategic components rather than emotional attachments. Influence was measured by a cumulative effect, not immediate outcome, and restraint became as critical as display of capability. Ambition was inseparable from calculation, foresight, and the orchestration of perception. Even in solitude, the castle provided instruction. Shadows, residual magic, and the rhythm of ambient sound conveyed subtle information, offering both caution and opportunity. Mastery required interpretation, integration, and deliberate action. Each decision, each pause, each observation contributed to a framework of influence that extended far beyond immediate perception, shaping both environment and outcomes in ways invisible to the unobservant. By the close of the 6th year, the fractures in light became evident. Those who failed to observe, anticipate, and adapt revealed themselves in subtle ways, creating openings for influence and opportunity. Those who mastered integration of observation, skill, and foresight could navigate the lattice of Hogwarts with precision and advantage. Power was no longer a function of magic alone. It was an orchestration of perception, intent, and circumstance, executed with patience, subtlety, and discipline. The castle, silent yet insistent, taught that mastery required awareness of both the visible and the hidden, the overt and the latent, the immediate and the accruing. Hogwarts demanded more than skill. It demanded calculation. Influence was measured in patterns, in observation, in anticipation. The fractures in light revealed the cost of oversight and the reward of vigilance. By attending to these currents, one could shape perception, manipulate circumstance, and extend control without confrontation. In the quiet aftermath of observation, the principle was clear. Mastery was inseparable from insight, patience, and the meticulous orchestration of both action and restraint. The castle, in its quiet insistence, had taught more than any classroom could. Years spent in observation, in the meticulous cataloguing of behavior and circumstance, had revealed the architecture of influence, the hidden lattice upon which both opportunity and consequence rested. Each corridor, each shadow, each whisper of residual magic had become a lesson, a signal, a test. Ambition, I had learned, was neither raw desire nor brash action. It was patient, measured, and calibrated. It thrived not in impulse, but in anticipation, in subtle manipulation of environment, perception, and circumstance. Slytherin, more than a house of green and silver, had been a crucible. There, the principles of restraint, calculation, and observation had been reinforced. Peer interactions, rivalries, and alliances had all served as instruments to sharpen perception, to practice strategic patience, and to understand both human and magical behavior. Each success had been deliberate. Each failure, though rare, had illuminated flaws in judgment, gaps in attention, or miscalculations in temperament. Lessons accrued not in isolation but in accumulation, shaping approach, strategy, and understanding. Magic itself had become inseparable from observation. Wandwork potions, charms each, now required awareness of context, residual energy, and potential consequence. Even minor miscalculations produced ripples through perception and social standing, demonstrating the inseparability of skill, environment, and influence. Mastery, I had discovered, was not defined by raw capability, but by integration, the ability to anticipate, observe, and act with precision in a world alive with both visible and invisible currents. Yet, for all that had been learned, the castle continued to conceal layers of complexity beyond immediate comprehension. Shadows shifted unpredictably. Alliances remained fluid. Latent magic pulsed beneath stone and water, responding to intent, emotion, and circumstance. The lessons of past years were not endpoints, but foundations, principles upon which the next challenges would be built. The patterns observed so far offered a map, but maps are never complete. They suggest pathways, not guarantees. Ahead lay new tests, subtle yet consequential. Currents of influence would become turbulence. Ambition would encounter resistance. Perception would be weighed against deception. The choices made in silence, in shadow, and in careful observation would determine position, leverage, and survival. The castle, patient as ever, would continue to measure, to respond, and to teach. Those who failed to notice or to integrate knowledge with foresight would stumble. Those who could anticipate, adapt, and act with precision would find opportunity. The path forward was neither clear nor simple. What had been learned was necessary but insufficient. The coming challenges would demand more than observations. They would demand courage measured by discretion, action tempered by calculation, and influence exercised with subtlety. Hogwarts had trained endurance, patience, and skill, but the true tests of perception and mastery were yet to come. And in that quiet, beneath the shifting shadows and the weight of stone, it was clear that the next steps would shape not only the immediate future, but the trajectory of those who had learned to watch, to calculate, and to wait. In this moment of stillness, the principle was undeniable. Mastery is never complete. It is always in motion, waiting for the next opportunity, the next subtle shift, the next decision made in silence. And in those shifts, the observant will rise, and the inattentive will falter.
The 7th year dawned with a weight that pressed upon the castle like a tangible presence. The corridors no longer felt expansive. They felt crowded with consequence, layered with history, expectation, and the invisible calculations of every student who had come before. Hogwarts, in its silent persistence, measured attentiveness as carefully as it measured skill. Residual enchantments hummed faintly beneath stone, shifting subtly with the flow of footsteps, voices, and intent. Observation, long honed, had become instinct. Awareness had become armor. Yet even mastery had limits, and the edges of understanding were constantly tested. Slytherin remained a crucible, but its lessons had evolved. Subtle rivalries were now compounded by alliances that were neither permanent nor predictable. The currency of influence had expanded to include knowledge of history, perception of faculty bias, and anticipation of others' strategies. Every glance, every gesture, every measured step was catalogued not merely for immediate effect, but for future application. Each peer, each interaction, carried multiple layers of meaning, and misjudgment could ripple across days, even weeks. In this environment, patience was not merely virtue, it was survival. Magic, too, had revealed new dimensions. Wandwork was no longer an exercise of technique alone, but of foresight, modulation, and context. Potions required subtle adjustments, calibrated not only to ingredients but to timing, environmental factors, and the likely reactions of observers. Residual spells persisted in corners, invisible but influential, and subtle manipulation of these currents could yield advantage or disaster. Mastery of magic was inseparable from mastery of perception. To act without awareness was to court failure. To observe without action was to waste opportunity. Interactions with other houses reflected the growing complexity of strategy. Gryffindor's confidence was tempered with cunning, Ravenclaw's intellect sharpened by competition, and Hufflepuff's loyalty now carried the weight of strategic alignment. The interplay of temperament, perception, and intent became a lattice in which subtle influence could be applied. Observation provided leverage. Anticipation allowed maneuvering without confrontation. Alliances were instruments, rivalry a guide, and every interaction offered a data point to be integrated into the ongoing calculus of opportunity. Faculty remained variables. Their preferences, expectations, and disciplinary patterns carefully noted. Responses were anticipated, influence calibrated, and presentation of skill refined to align with perception. Misstep invited scrutiny. Precision rewarded attention. The classroom had become a theater in which subtle demonstration of ability shaped both reputation and leverage. Knowledge and skill were necessary but insufficient. Understanding the currents of expectation and aligning action with perception produced true influence. The castle itself seemed more alive than ever. Corridors shifted in both form and consequence. Staircases, though predictable in function, carried subtle lessons in balance and patience. Residual magic pulsed faintly in abandoned classrooms and laboratories, echoing past intention. Shadows deepened, and the spaces between light and dark contained information, warnings, and opportunity. Mastery required integration, observation, foresight, discipline, and subtle manipulation of circumstance. Each movement, each choice, was a test in perception as much as in skill. By mid-year, the framework of observation, calculation, and subtle influence had solidified into a methodology both instinctive and deliberate. Patterns of behavior, latent magical currents, and environmental cues coalesced into a lattice of anticipation and action. Alliances, rivalries, and the perception of power were navigated not impulsively but as components of a larger design. Patience and strategic restraint became as potent as skill and aptitude. Ambition was inseparable from foresight, and every act, no matter how small, was measured in its potential long-term consequence. Even solitude offered instruction. Night corridors, abandoned laboratories, and the quiet spaces beneath Slytherin's common room revealed subtle currents invisible to the inattentive. Shadows, echoes of spellwork, and traces of emotion persisted, offering insight into both environment and temperament. Each observation was integrated into ongoing strategy, every subtle detail catalogued for potential leverage. Mastery was not merely technique or knowledge. It was awareness applied continuously, with foresight, precision, and patience. As the year progressed, fractures in the apparent stability of Hogwarts became more pronounced. Rivalry sharpened, alliances shifted imperceptibly, and subtle manipulations of perception reshaped influence without confrontation. The castle, as always, measured response, rewarded observation, and silently guided the outcomes of those capable of integrating skill, insight, and foresight. The patterns were clear to those who watched, calculated, and acted with deliberate restraint. Power was neither immediate nor absolute, but accrued through patience, perception, and subtle orchestration of circumstance. By the close of the 7th year, it was evident that the culmination of past lessons, observation, calculation, discipline, and subtle influence would define not only mastery within the walls of Hogwarts, but the trajectory beyond them. The castle remained both tutor and arbiter, shaping perception, testing foresight, and rewarding the capacity to act with precision. Shadows, subtle currents, and hidden patterns had become instruments in the orchestration of influence. Mastery, at its edge, was the capacity to perceive, anticipate, and shape outcomes without overt display, a quiet assertion of control that extended far beyond the immediate and visible. In this environment, the principle was clear. The observant endure, the patient prosper, and the subtle prevail. Every step, every glance, every measured act of restraint contributed to the accumulation of influence, the shaping of perception, and the preparation for challenges yet unseen. The castle, silent and persistent, demanded nothing less than complete attentiveness, strategic patience, and the precise integration of knowledge, skill, and foresight. The edge of shadows had been reached, and beyond it lay trials that would measure not merely ability, but perception, calculation, and mastery over both circumstance and self. The coming months would reveal how fully the lessons of observation, patience, and subtle influence had been internalized. In the quiet corridors, beneath the watchful weight of stone and history, the path forward remained uncertain, yet shaped entirely by those capable of seeing what others overlooked. The final year unfolded under a gravity that was palpable, pressing down with the weight of accumulated knowledge, observation, and anticipation. Hogwarts, vast and layered with history, seemed to respond to the collective intention of its students, amplifying tension and testing discernment. Corridors, once familiar, now felt charged with consequence. Every shadow, every flicker of torchlight, every echo of footsteps seemed to carry warning or opportunity. Observation, honed over 6 years, had become instinct, yet instinct alone was insufficient. The stakes had shifted. Influence, skill, and perception now intersected with choice in ways that demanded deliberate calculation. Within Slytherin, alliances and rivalries had become intricate. Fluid systems constantly adjusted to the pressures of ambition, temperament, and circumstance. Relationships were no longer defined by proximity or convenience, but by utility, perception, and potential leverage. Every gesture, glance, or carefully measured word could reinforce position or invite compromise. Trust was rationed, extended only when mutual advantage outweighed risk, and withdrawn when calculation dictated. The subtle management of expectation became as crucial as mastery of magic, and the ability to anticipate intention both spoken and hidden was essential to navigating the lattice of influence. Magic, as ever, reflected the complexities of social dynamics. Wandwork, spells, and potion-making required integration with context, observation, and anticipation. The consequences of miscalculation extended beyond failure in a task to include perception, leverage, and social capital. Residual enchantments persisted in spaces long after their casting, and the ability to interpret and manipulate these currents became both a tool and a measure of mastery. Power, I had learned, was inseparable from perception. Skill alone could not guarantee influence, nor could intent alone achieve outcome. Both required calibration, patience, and awareness. Interactions across houses had reached a delicate equilibrium. Gryffindor's assertiveness was tempered with careful attention. Ravenclaw's intellect masked subtle competition, and Hufflepuff's loyalty carried strategic weight. Observation and anticipation allowed navigation of these dynamics without overt confrontation. Influence was exercised not through domination but through subtle alignment, orchestration of perception, and the careful shaping of circumstance. Each interaction, whether casual or deliberate, was catalogued, integrated, and evaluated for potential leverage, forming a cumulative map of opportunity and consequence. Faculty remained a persistent variable. Their patterns of evaluation, preference, and discipline were increasingly predictable, yet still required careful attention. Each gesture, inflection, and pause conveyed nuance, offering potential leverage or risk depending on interpretation and response. Mastery involved alignment of skill and presentation with perception, ensuring that influence accrued not through display but through strategic integration. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Observation and the manipulation of circumstance were equally essential. The castle, ever responsive, continued to teach through shadow, echo, and residual magic. Corridors and rooms carried subtle imprints of previous intention, behavioral residue, and lingering enchantments. The ability to read these signals, to anticipate consequence, and to act with precision remained indispensable. Each movement, each calculated pause, each decision of engagement or restraint contributed to a lattice of influence that extended far beyond immediate perception. Mastery now demanded integration of all previous lessons: skill, observation, anticipation, patience, and subtlety. By mid-year, it became clear that the culmination of years of preparation rested upon the exercise of judgment. Choice, once abstract, had become tangible. Every decision a vector shaping consequence and influence. The interplay of observation, calculation, and subtle manipulation of perception created pathways to advantage. But these pathways required courage tempered by discretion. Misstep, overreach, or misjudgment could unravel influence painstakingly cultivated over years. The weight of choice, silent but absolute, defined every action. Even in isolation, the castle imparted lessons. Shadows, ambient sound, and residual magical currents offered insight, warning, and opportunity. Each observation, each integration of knowledge, became part of a larger calculus that guided decision and action. Mastery was no longer simply about skill or insight. It was about the capacity to navigate the lattice of consequence with deliberate precision. Every step, glance, and hesitation carried weight, and every subtle action contributed to long-term positioning. As the year progressed, fractures, instability became more evident. Rivalries sharpened, alliances shifted imperceptibly, and perception became both weapon and shield. The castle, ever insistent, amplified these dynamics, rewarding those capable of careful calculation and disciplined foresight. Mastery required not only the recognition of patterns, but the courage to act within them, to exert influence without overexposure, to choose with awareness of both immediate and latent consequence. By the close of the 12th chapter, the principle was undeniable. Influence and power are inseparable from the weight of choice. Observation, calculation, and patience provide tools, but only deliberate, disciplined action solidifies advantage. The castle had taught endurance, subtlety, and foresight. Now it demanded application. Every shadow held information, every gesture carried potential, and every choice rippled outward, shaping both perception and opportunity. In this environment, mastery is defined not by the absence of error, but by the precision and foresight with which one navigates consequence. Choice, I understood, is never neutral. It is always a vector, shaping perception, positioning, and the flow of influence. In Hogwarts corridors, beneath the weight of history and latent magic, the careful exercise of judgment became the ultimate measure of mastery and the key to what lay beyond.
The 7th year had reached a stage where the castle itself seemed to breathe with expectation. Each stone, corridor, and chamber attuned to the weight of intention. Hogwarts had long ceased to be merely a school. It had become a living lattice of observation, anticipation, and consequence. Shadows, residual enchantments, and subtle shifts in atmosphere offered information to those willing to notice. Years of discipline had honed perception into instinct, yet instinct alone was insufficient. The currents of influence now demanded foresight paired with decisive, measured action. Every detail, the position of a chair, the cadence of footsteps, the hesitation in a glance carried meaning, waiting to be interpreted and employed. Within Slytherin, alliances and rivalries had evolved into complex, fluid constructs. Influence was not declared openly. It was accrued in silence, in precision, and in the subtle orchestration of circumstance. Peer relationships functioned as instruments, calibrated by observation and deployed strategically. Each interaction revealed patterns, gestures, habits, and reactions that could be exploited to gain advantage or neutralized threat. Trust was conditional, extended sparingly, and withdrawn immediately when utility waned. In this environment, mastery of perception and timing had become as crucial as magical skill itself. Magic operated within these social currents as both tool and measure. Wand work, potions, and charms were exercises not only in technical proficiency, but in anticipation, control, and manipulation of context. Residual magic persisted in every corridor, classroom, and laboratory, subtly shifting outcomes according to intention, awareness, and precision. Even minor miscalculations, improper timing, unnoticed environmental influence, or misjudged perception could have cascading consequences. Mastery required the integration of knowledge, observation, and foresight, executed with subtlety and patience. Interactions with other houses had grown increasingly strategic. Gryffindor's boldness was tempered with emerging calculation. Ravenclaw's intellect carried both pride and rivalry, and Hufflepuff's loyalty could be marshaled as strategic leverage. Observation provided data. Anticipation allowed navigation of the lattice of influence without direct confrontation. Success was rarely instantaneous. It was cumulative, accrued over weeks and months through careful application of insight, timing, and subtle manipulation. The ability to act imperceptibly, yet with consequence, had become the hallmark of enduring influence. Faculty, always variables in the broader lattice, required constant attention. Their evaluations, preferences, and disciplinary tendencies could be discerned through subtle observation of gestures, inflection, and timing, aligning action with perception, demonstrating skill without overreach, and exercising discretion had become essential components of influence. Knowledge alone could not secure advantage. It was observation and calibrated action that translated understanding into power. The castle itself continued to instruct, even in moments of isolation. Empty corridors, quiet laboratories, and shadowed common rooms revealed traces of intent, lingering enchantments, and echoes of interaction. Subtle signal shifts in light, the residue of spellwork, or the pattern of ambient sound, offered both warning and opportunity. Integration of these observations into deliberate strategy defined the difference between passive awareness and active mastery. Every movement, every calculated pause, every subtle gesture became part of a lattice of influence that extended beyond immediate perception. By mid-year, it became apparent that mastery rested not only on skill and observation, but on the patient orchestration of circumstance. Fractures in relationships, shifts in perception, and the latent influence of past interactions created opportunities for those attentive enough to exploit them. Influence was accumulated invisibly, often without acknowledgement, yet its effects rippled through both peers and faculty. The castle measured all, rewarding those who acted with foresight and restraint, while punishing overreach or inattentiveness. Even in solitude, the quiet machinations of the environment provided instruction. Shadows, echoes, and residual magical currents offered insight into both environment and temperament. Each observation was integrated into ongoing strategy. Each subtle detail became a tool for influence, shaping perception and positioning. Mastery was now defined not merely by skill, knowledge, or observation, but by the deliberate and precise application of all three in concert with foresight and timing. By the close of this chapter, the principle was undeniable. Influence is seldom asserted openly. It is cultivated silently through observation, calculation, and patient orchestration of circumstance. Hogwarts, with its shifting shadows and layered histories, demanded constant vigilance, subtlety, and foresight. Mastery existed at the intersection of perception, patience, and precise action. And those capable of navigating these currents could shape outcomes far beyond what was immediately visible. The quiet machinations of the castle peers and residual magic converged into a single, persistent lesson. Power accrues to those who see, who anticipate, and who act with precision. In the silent corridors, beneath the weight of stone and history, the observant endure, the patient advance, and the subtle prevail. The edge of mastery had been reached, yet the true test where choice, foresight, and influence intersected was only beginning. The final months at Hogwarts carried a weight that pressed into every corner, every stone, and every corridor. The castle no longer felt passive. It felt deliberate, as if it were aware of the culmination of observation, calculation, and subtle influence that had been exercised over the preceding years. Shadows deepened, not simply from absence of light, but as a reflection of intent, residual magic, and the unseen interplay of human will. Each step in the corridors became an exercise in anticipation, each glance a test of perception. By now, the lessons of patience, restraint, and careful orchestration were inseparable from daily existence. Mastery demanded that one move not merely through space, but through consequence itself. Within Slytherin, the web of alliances and rivalries had solidified into something simultaneously resilient and precarious. Peers moved as though aware, in some measure, of the lattice of influence threading through the house. Subtle gestures, whispered suggestions, and deliberate omissions all functioned as instruments of control and assessment. Trust remained a calculated commodity. Relationships were evaluated constantly, measured against ambition, skill, and perception. To navigate this environment required integration of all prior lessons: observation, calculation, discretion, and the ability to act with impact while remaining imperceptible. The house had become a microcosm of strategy, and survival demanded continuous attention to every nuance. Magic, in turn, reflected the complexity of these social currents. Wand work, potion-making, and charms were exercises not only in skill but in anticipation, context, and precise timing. Residual enchantments pulsed faintly in every classroom and corridor, and the ability to perceive and manipulate these subtle currents became both a tool and a measure of mastery. Misjudgment, even minor, could ripple outward, affecting not only immediate outcomes but also perception, reputation, and influence. Conversely, subtle precision allowed action to shape environment and expectation, reinforcing advantage without overt display. Mastery was inseparable from perception. Technique alone was insufficient. The interplay of other houses had grown more intricate. Gryffindor's assertiveness was tempered by growing calculation. Ravenclaw's intellect was sharpened with subtle rivalry, and Hufflepuff's loyalty now carried strategic weight. Observation and anticipation allowed navigation of this lattice without direct confrontation, exercising influence through timing, perception, and calculated alignment rather than through force. Each interaction was catalogued mentally, integrated into a larger understanding of temperament, influence, and opportunity. Success was accrued invisibly, measured over time, and dependent upon the careful orchestration of subtle action. Faculty remained persistent variables in this system. Their patterns of evaluation, preference, and discipline were increasingly discernible, yet still required continuous observation. Strategic alignment of skill, presentation, and discretion produced influence without overt assertion. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Perception, calculation, and integration of environment and circumstance were essential. Hogwarts demanded constant vigilance, demonstrating that mastery of magic without mastery of awareness and timing was incomplete. The castle itself, ever alive with history, residual magic, and latent intent, continued to instruct through subtlety. Empty corridors, quiet laboratories, and shadowed common rooms conveyed information in echo, residual energies, and shifts in ambience. Each observation was integrated into ongoing strategy, forming a lattice in which anticipation guided action and restraint preserved influence. Shadows were not absence of light. They were vectors of information, potential leverage, and warning. Understanding and utilizing these currents had become as important as mastery of spells or potions. By mid-year, the patterns of influence, residual magic, and interpersonal dynamics had reached convergence. Fractures in alliances became apparent. Shifts in perception created openings, and subtle manipulations reshaped the lattice of control without overt confrontation. Influence was no longer merely a function of observation and skill. It was the deliberate orchestration of circumstance, perception, and timing. Patience and subtlety had become as potent as magic itself, and those capable of applying them with precision could shape outcomes far beyond immediate perception. Even in isolation, the castle continued to provide instruction. Night corridors, empty chambers, and shadowed alcoves revealed currents of residual magic, emotional residue, and traces of interaction that offered insight, caution, and opportunity. Integration of these observations into deliberate strategy defined the difference between mere awareness and active mastery. Every pause, glance, and calculated gesture became a vector, shaping both perception and consequence. As the year progressed, the convergence of these currents produced a clarity. The final tests would measure not only skill but perception, calculation, and the capacity to act with foresight. The castle, faculty, peers, and residual magic combined into a lattice of influence and consequence in which misstep could unravel years of preparation, and subtle, deliberate action could yield decisive advantage. Mastery, in its fullest sense, demanded not only knowledge and skill, but the precise orchestration of all these elements in concert. The lesson was unmistakable. The shadows are never idle, and neither are those who observe them. Influence, power, and survival are accumulated, not seized, and the observant navigate currents that others cannot perceive. Hogwarts, in its quiet insistence, measured patience, foresight, and the disciplined application of skill, rewarding those who integrated these qualities and punishing those who relied on impulse or force. The convergence of shadows, history, and human intent had become absolute, revealing the truth long taught, but only now fully comprehended. Mastery is not granted, it is orchestrated, quietly, deliberately, and with unerring precision. The final months at Hogwarts had a weight that pressed into every corner of the castle, and the corridors no longer felt merely passageways. They had become instruments of observation, calculation, and subtle negotiation. Every step carried consequence. Every shadow, every flicker of torchlight, and every echo of movement offered information for those willing to perceive it. By now, the lessons of patience, discretion, and deliberate orchestration were inseparable from daily existence. The lattice of influence, long invisible to the inattentive, had crystallized, and those who navigated it with precision commanded outcomes without overt display. The castle, silent yet watchful, measured intent as carefully as it measured skill. Within Slytherin, the web of alliances, rivalries, and strategic dependencies had grown increasingly intricate. Peers acted with awareness, calibrating gestures, speech, and subtle cues to signal alignment or test loyalty. Trust remained a measured commodity, extended only when the utility outweighed the risk, withdrawn at the first sign of compromise. Each interaction, whether fleeting or sustained, offered both information and potential leverage. The house had become a laboratory of influence, where patience and subtlety often outweighed boldness or ostentation. Mastery of perception and timing was now as critical as mastery of magic itself. Magic had become inseparable from these dynamics. Wand work, charms, and potion-making required precision, foresight, and awareness of latent currents within the castle. Residual spells persisted in corridors and classrooms, subtle yet impactful, influencing both environment and perception. The smallest miscalculation, poorly timed gesture, an overlooked detail, or a misjudged reaction could ripple outward, affecting reputation, influence, and opportunity. Conversely, subtle mastery could shape circumstance, manipulating outcome while remaining imperceptible to observers. Power existed not in display, but in orchestration. Interactions beyond Slytherin had grown equally nuanced. Gryffindor's bravado was tempered with strategic consideration. Ravenclaw's intellect carried pride and subtle competition, and Hufflepuff's loyalty could be leveraged with careful calculation. Observation allowed anticipation. Perception allowed navigation without confrontation. Influence was exercised not through force, but through timing, alignment, and subtle intervention. Each interaction contributed to a growing mental lattice of opportunity and risk, where careful attention to detail became the primary instrument of advantage. Faculty remained variables whose tendencies, preferences, and patterns were meticulously observed. Aligning action with perception and demonstrating skill without arrogance produced influence invisibly, reinforcing advantage over time. Missteps invited scrutiny. Subtlety and restraint commanded attention. Knowledge alone was insufficient. Mastery required integration of observation, calculation, and strategic action, applied with patience and precision. Hogwarts demanded vigilance at all levels, teaching that skill and awareness alone could not ensure survival only. Their deliberate application could. The castle itself continued to instruct in silence. Residual magic, emotional echoes, and ambient sound offered subtle cues about environment, intention, and opportunity. Even in solitude, every corridor, staircase, and chamber provided information to be integrated into strategy. Shadows were vectors of insight. Pauses and hesitations were data. Mastery had become an exercise in the orchestration of perception, action, and consequence, where every detail held potential leverage or warning. By Medea, the lattice of influence, observation, and latent magic had converged into a precise system of advantage. Fractures in alliances, shifts in perception, and subtle manipulations of circumstance produced openings for those capable of anticipating and exploiting them. Influence was accumulated silently, measured over time, and reinforced through careful orchestration rather than overt assertion. Patience, foresight, and subtlety were as potent as magic itself. Those who applied these qualities with discipline could shape outcomes far beyond what was visible, exerting control without confrontation. Even isolation became a site of instruction. Empty classrooms, deserted laboratories, and shadowed corridors revealed residual intent, ambient currents, and traces of previous action. Observation, integration, and foresight transformed these signals into tools, guiding both perception and strategy. Mastery existed not merely in skill, but in the precise application of awareness and patience, where every movement, gesture, and decision influenced both immediate and long-term outcomes. By the close of the 15th chapter, the principle was undeniable. Power is not seized. It is quietly orchestrated through observation, calculation, and disciplined action. Hogwarts measured patience, foresight, and subtlety, rewarding those who integrated skill with perception and punishing those who relied on impulse or display. The corridors, shadows, and latent currents had become instruments, and those capable of navigating them with precision held dominion not through force, but through silent mastery. In this environment, the lesson was absolute. The observant endure, the patient prosper, and the subtle prevail. Influence is never immediate. It is accumulated through deliberate, precise orchestration, executed in quiet moments and unseen spaces. The castle, ancient and watchful, had become both teacher and arbiter, demonstrating that true mastery is inseparable from patience, calculation, and the disciplined management of both circumstance and perception. Those who commanded these currents commanded far more than spells. They commanded the very lattice of opportunity itself. As the year drew closer to its end, the castle seemed to thrum with a quiet intensity, an almost imperceptible vibration that spoke of consequence, vigilance, and latent potential, and the subtle orchestration of action. Each corridor, chamber, and stairwell seemed to carry memory, not merely of spells cast or footsteps taken, but of intent, ambition, and the weight of choices. By now, the lessons of prior years had converged into instinct. Observation was reflex, anticipation was constant, and calculation was inseparable from action. Peer alliances, rivalries, and networks of influence had crystallized into intricate lattice. Subtle gestures, fleeting expressions, and carefully timed omissions carried meaning far beyond the apparent. Trust was rationed, extended selectively, and withdrawn when calculations deemed it necessary. Each interaction, whether a casual exchange in the common room or a fleeting glance in a corridor, was data to be interpreted, integrated, and leveraged. Mastery now demanded continuous attention, as lapses in observation could ripple outward with consequences disproportionate to their apparent scale. Magic, as ever, reflected these currents. Residual enchantments in corridors and laboratories, echoes of spells long cast. Even the smallest misstepper, misapplied incantation, a poorly timed gesture, a slight misreading of an environment could unravel days or weeks of careful calculation. Conversely, subtle mastery could bend circumstance to advantage, creating outcomes without overt demonstration of force. It required integration with perception, timing, and silent influence. Gryffindor's boldness now operated alongside emerging calculation. It accumulated quietly, imperceptibly, through observation, measured action, and strategic alignment. Faculty remained variables in the lattice. Their tendencies, preferences, and patterns of oversight were noted, predicted, and accounted for in every calculated action. Mastery required understanding not only spells and potions, but the subtle currents of evaluation and expectation flowing from the professors themselves. And the interplay of ambient sound offered insight into both environment and intention, but canvas upon which subtle influence could be exercised. Blip and subtle influence had produced a methodology both instinctive and deliberate. Fractures in alliances, subtle shifts in perception, and imperceptible manipulations of circumstance provided openings for those capable of integrating foresight with action. Patience, subtlety, and disciplined calculation had become as powerful as any spell or potion. Even isolation offered instruction. Shadows, residual enchantments, and ambient currents conveyed subtle signals about environment, temperament, and opportunity. Integration of these observations into deliberate action allowed navigation of the castle and its occupants with precision. Mastery now demanded not only skill, knowledge, and observation, but the calculated application of all three in concert with foresight and timing. By the close of the 16th chapter, the principle was unmistakable. Observation, calculation, and patient action cultivate opportunity, and the castle, ever attentive, rewards those capable of integrating all these elements. The corridors, shadows, and residual magic had become instruments of control, and those who moved with precision commanded far more than spells. They commanded perception, circumstance, and consequence itself. Those who could observe, anticipate, and act without detection had dominion over both outcome and perception. The castle had grown silent, yet its presence remained as palpable as ever. Time had passed, and the halls that once seemed impossibly vast now carried echoes of lessons. Hogwarts did not forget, nor did it reward those who relied solely on strength or impulse. In this quiet, the truth became unmistakable. Mastery was not a culmination of skill alone, but of disciplined observation, patient calculation, and the careful orchestration of circumstance. Rivalries had revealed themselves as lessons in patience and leverage. The castle, in its patient observation, had been both instructor and arbiter. Magic itself remained a tool, but its power was inseparable from awareness. Hand perfected, but true control required reading the currents in which magic flowed, the ambient enchantments, the residual effects, plies of influence and consequence. Once confined to corridors and common rooms, extended outward into every interaction, every decision, and every calculated move. Those who had learned to navigate the shadows, to perceive the currents of intent. The world, much like Hogwarts, responded to attention, strategy, and the precise orchestration of influence. Skill alone could not command it. Perception and calculation were indispensable, and subtlety revealed a simple, immutable principle. Power is inseparable from understanding. Those who master it do not announce themselves in flame or fury. They endure, they anticipate, and they act with quiet precision, shaping the world as though it were always their instrument. As the castle receded into memory, the principle remained. Mastery exists not in visibility, but in subtlety. Not in assertion, but in understanding. And not in action alone, but in the careful orchestration of perception, circumstance, and consequence. In the quiet, beneath the weight of history and stone, the lesson of Hogwarts endured. The patient, the observant, and the subtle are those who prevail, shaping both present and future with deliberate precision. In that stillness, it was clear that the end was not a conclusion,